This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Polly Nicholson. Polly is the owner of Bayntun Flowers in Wiltshire and holds the National Collection of Tulipa Historica with plant heritage. Polly has also written a book called The Tulip Garden, Growing and Collecting Species, Rare and Annual Varieties, which is released on the 21st of March. And today, she shares her knowledge of this complex and fascinating group of plants.
So the historic collection has been registered with Plant Heritage for about 3 years as a National Collection of Tulipa Historic, which they have several categories, of which I fall into the historic one. And I started collecting tulips for it way in advance of that 3-year classification or certification. So probably about 10 years or so. We first found a tulip called Tulipa Dom Pedro, which is this amazingly deep mahogany colour brushed with bronze in a fairly ordinary catalogue, but it jumped out at us and we thought, well, this looks a little bit different. And when it arrived, of course, the bulb, like any other tulip bulb, looks pretty much the same. To the expert eye, you can see differences, but a tulip bulb is a tulip bulb. But when it came up the next spring, it was something entirely different. And it was in this colour range, which I hadn't experienced with annual tulips ever before. They were known as art shades in America in the 1920s, and they were all the rage then. But it was new to my eyes, and that started an obsession with these tulips, which are hard to find, not commercially available, and to me, extra special.
And I think I'm right in saying that in addition to your living collection, you've also got a herbarium that you've curated.
Yes, what I try and do is press a selection of tulips each year. So I keep my own record called a herbarium. And this serves as a reference for me so I can look back year on year and see how my collection has developed and research it from there. And I actually spent a really interesting day at RHS Wisley last year in their herbarium. And they're coming back this spring to collect tulips with me and press them and add them to their collection, which I feel really honoured and excited about.
Yeah, you are incredibly meticulous with your record keeping, and it shows in your book that you've written. So in general terms, I know there is an awful lot to it. And I realised this again, reading your book. I thought, wow, this is such a broad subject and I'm not sure that I can get my head around it off the back of that. But in general terms, what are the kind of tulips that you're looking at and that you're dealing with, and how do they differ maybe from ones that other people might have come across in bulb catalogues?
Well, you'll see from the book, I actually have 4 different chapters. And the idea is that there's something for everybody, whatever their interest. So the first chapter is all on species tulips, which we plant out in the garden in the place of where people would perhaps traditionally have planted big annual or hybrid tulip plantings, the type you might still see in a park in a city centre today. So we use species tulips, which are much smaller and quieter, both herbaceously and naturalised in grass. So we have naturalised plantings of Tulipa cornuta with its needle-pointed tips, Tulipa axamensis, which flowers right through into June amazingly, Tulipa sprengeri, and we also have masses of species tulips planted in pots dotted around the garden. So that's my first chapter. Then I move on to the historic tulips, which we divide into Dutch historics, which the earliest in the collection dates from 1595. It's a tiny tulip called Tulipa Red and Yellow, which is a Duke van Tull variety. And then the most recent of the historic tulips, believe it or not, is from 2008, called In a Wheel. And that's bred in the vein of a Rembrandt tulip, but it's a modern one, quite hard to get hold of, I'm afraid. And then we have English florists tulips, which are a totally different part of the collection. And they're these incredibly refined, slightly smaller in some cases. And they're the type of tulips which, when you think of a broken tulip in terms of the Dutch period called tulipomania, which might be amazing red and white symmetrical striped patterns, those are the sorts of tulips which perhaps are most representative of that period now. And finally in the book, I move on to the annual, also known as garden or hybrid tulips, which are very easy to get hold of. and I show how to use those to effect in containers. So we have massive container plantings here at Blacklands, which spill out of these large vintage vessels. So, I mean, really super sized, which stand at sentinel points in the garden. And we change the colour schemes for these every year. So our visitors who come to workshops or the National Garden Scheme get a surprise. And it might be a bit too much of a surprise this year because we've gone garish for the first time.
And for the uninitiated, are there any categories of tulips that fall outside your collection that people might be familiar with or that you've kind of omitted for any particular reason?
I'm sure there are many tulips which are outside because there are 2,500 to 3,000 different tulip cultivars available on the market today. So I feel that the rest of my life is likely to be a tulip discovery. But I do cover all 16 divisions within my garden. So you'll see at the back of my book, I've written a nice section on the different divisions, and I've highlighted some of my favourites throughout that. So you'll get lily flowered, which are on top of my list because they have good perennial habits if you plant them out in the garden, and viridifloras likewise. So listeners might be very familiar with spring green or flaming spring green. Those are viridiflora tulips, which have a component of green in the tepals as well. And they have good repeat flowering habits. And I think that's because the extra green in the petals, they can photosynthesize more effectively because of the extra green. And that serves to bulk up the bulb for the next year. So we love those. I should say I'm big on perennial plantings because we have a very strong environmental bent. We are certified with the Soil Association UK, and we like to make sure that we work in tandem with the environment as much as possible. So when we do container plantings which have new tulips in them, we then recycle those tulip bulbs and we plant them on all of our rough grass verges so they come back and greet us each spring with this cacophony of colour.
What else do you do to ensure that you're growing sustainably? I think you do a lot around propagation, don't you?
Well, we, for a start, buy as many bulbs organically as we can, but that's not that easy in the UK. There's not many suppliers. They're ahead of us in Holland, but it's not, as I'm sure other people know, that easy to import now post-Brexit. So we try and buy organically when we can. And then when they're here, the bulbs are treated organically from the moment they arrive here. So we make sure that the beds they're being planted in are in prime condition. We work hard to ensure the drainage is right, and we use organic matter to improve the soil structure. And then when they're actually planted, we would never ever treat them with any type of herbicide or fungicide or insecticide. So we feed them with organic seaweed feed. We monitor them the whole time to check on their health. We make sure that they're not planted too close together, so there's good air circulation. They get a lot of wet and a lot of wind here in Wiltshire, and actually that's really good for them. I suppose it's the husbandry which takes the precedence over any type of inputs that other people might perhaps revert to in the commercial tulip industry.
And going back again to what you said about the perennial plantings of the annual tulips, is there anything people can do? I think it's a commonly held belief that when you use your annual tulips, you can just basically dig them up and discard them because they won't do another year. But yeah, I'm guessing that's a bit of a misconception, is it?
If you look at certain divisions, as I said, lily flowered and viridiflora are our favourites to start with. Try planting a few perennially and see how they do. They won't come up all uniform as they would if you did a big new planting of bulbs. You'll find that for the first year at least, they'll perhaps be smaller and you'll get a variety of sizes. But we now much prefer that more natural look to having these serried ranks of tulips marching across the property.
Again, with the species tulips, obviously they're designed to be perennial, and I think people think they need good drainage, they need sun maybe throughout the warmer periods. Is there anything that you can do to help them multiply, to bulk up, to be happier where you put them? I mean, I've planted some and lost them, so obviously put them in the wrong place, but what can people do to encourage them?
Well, a lot of it's trial and error. You've got to experiment. So start off by buying a few and plant them and see how they do. And if they disappear like yours have, you've learned that's the wrong place or possibly the wrong tulip. But one of the important things to do is to plant them in areas where you don't have to irrigate during the summer, because tulips want to dry out completely in the summer and bake under the soil as they would in their natural conditions. So you remember these tulips come from places like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where they would be cold, that they're growing on the cold steppes of mountains and valley floors. So they're cold in the winter, but they get really hot and dry in the summer. So we want to try and emulate those same conditions with the species tulips. So don't plant them anywhere you're going to have to water your beds. So, we have areas called the woodland garden, and in those beds we tend not to irrigate, or the trees might be giving extra help to the species tulips by sucking up moisture in the summer and creating a better atmosphere environment for them.
You're probably right. Maybe it was the wrong tulip and the wrong place. So yes, I will definitely try again. So Polly, within the book, I noticed that the Dutch historic categories are broken into breeder and broken. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Well, yes, the Dutch historic category, it's a very big category because it dates from 1595 right up to about 2008. And tulips are allowed within our historic collection if they are very rare, hard to get hold of, not commercial, and have special features. And probably the feature which most people are familiar with historic tulip is the fact that they can be what's called broken, otherwise known as variegated or rectified or even striped. And what this means is that the breeder bulbs, which, as you pointed out, are treated separately, breeder bulbs being plain or solid coloured tulips, they break into these amazing patterns of the type that we see in the Dutch Old Masters from the 17th century, for instance. If you look at a Boschart painting, you will see that there's these amazing, extraordinarily coloured patterned tulips, which caused the period known as tulip mania in the 1630s. So the breeder tulips, which are the solid coloured ones, they will unexpectedly shatter or break into these broken ones. And this was a mystery right up until the 1920s. People thought that it was some type of alchemy which was making them break, and they would try any way to force this to happen by sprinkling coloured powders on the soil or grafting different bulbs together to try and get them to break and have these extra special valuable tulips. And it was in, I think, 1927 at the John Innes Institute in London, where Dorothy Cayley saw under a microscope that it was actually aphids that were causing this break. So aphids were feasting on a broken bulb and then hopping or flying over onto a plain coloured one and infected it with something called tulip breaking virus. So we divide them into the book as breeder and broken so that you can see how they are in their different states.
I mean, it's fascinating stuff. And thinking about the English florist tulips, some of those as well are broken, aren't they?
Exactly. And the English florist tulips, which you probably have noticed, they look quite different. They're all about the form and the purity and the perfection of the markings. They too are treated as breeder and broken. And in fact, the Tulip Society, of which I'm a member, they hold an annual show each year, and the schedule asks that you submit different tulips into different classes according to whether they're breeder or broken. So yes, we treat those in the same way as well in the book.
In the book, they throw up some fantastic photographs because they're the ones that are displayed in the beer bottles. But when you say they're judged on the uniformity of the markings, is there any way of knowing that before they come up, given that it's such a uncontrollable kind of variation on the bulb?
Well, you hope that if the previous year's bulb produced really good markings, then the new bulb, because with a tulip bulb, it actually replaces itself every year with a new mother bulb. You would hope those would be equally good. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that. So that's the idea, is to get bulbs which almost get better and better each year. But you can't be guaranteed you're going to have a perfect flame or a perfect feather. A feather being the markings confined to the outside edges of the petals in a beautiful, delicate, continuous line, and a flame being a rib of colour which comes out of the middle of each petal and then radiates to the outside where it feathers again at the tips. So you're after a perfect flame or a perfect feather in beautiful symmetrical markings. So it's quite something to aim for.
It is. It's such an art, really. The whole category of tulips is vast, and as I say, you cover it so well in the book. And thinking again about the broader overview, I guess you could talk forever about colours, and I could listen forever because they're so fascinating and varied. And, just when you think you found your favourite, you go and find something else, and you maybe the mood will take you to go off on a different colour palette. But thinking about years ahead, or even current year, have you noticed that you're drawn to a particular colour, or is there a particular colour that's kind of popping up in the zeitgeist that people are really falling for at the moment?
Well, I really love the browns, which I was describing earlier. So the ones which were incredibly popular in the 1920s in between the wars, they really appeal to me. So tulips like Dom Pedro, which are rich mahogany in colour. And as I said, the browns are known as the art shades from that period. I think they might come back into fashion. I also adore the really early Duke Van Tol ones, which come up like pops of colour earlier than any other tulips. So we've got Duke Van Tol scarlet flowering in the garden at the moment, which is an unbelievably saturated red. And it brings joy at a period of the year where actually there's not a great deal in this climate to celebrate.
Yeah, quite. I mean, I went to Pashley Manor because that's in my neck of the woods. They do a tulip festival, and I really fell in love with Le Paz, which I don't know if you've come across. And I got ashamed to say I don't know what sort it is, but they had a sort of reddy brown colour to it. So yeah, I do get that.
Yeah, I think there might be a bit of a resurgence of those. I mean, another one which I'm very keen on is called Dillenburg, which dates from, I think, 1916. And that was favoured by Christopher Lloyd at Great Dixter. And that has this same sort of indefinable colour. It's more of an orange than a brown, but it has this beautiful pink flush on the outside petals. And I find that really alluring as well. Again, it's called an art shade. It's the same range. So look for colours which you can't obviously name. And that's quite a good direction to go in. There's another one called Bleu Aimable, which is a Crelage Darwin from 1916. And that's this sort of bluey mauve colour, which somebody called Knicker Pink, which I thought was quite a nice description for it.
Yeah, that's a Dixter favourite, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that one. And actually, it does really well. It produces really good offsets each year. So I can grow those on and know that I'm being as sustainable as possible and buying fewer rather than more tulips.
So, Polly, apart from getting hold of the book, how can people find out more about what you're doing?
I'm on Instagram. I've got a website called Bayntun Flowers, which is really hard to spell, but Bayntun Flowers. And then I've got a series of talks coming up at the Garden Museum, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I'm talking about tulips in art, and at the Generous Gardener in Gloucestershire. So I'm going to be out and about, and you can see details of those on my website. I'm also at the Burford Garden Company for a signing and at Durham Park. So I'm very much going to be out of the garden this spring, which is quite surprising for me because usually I'm tucked away at this time of year tending the tulips. So I'm going to have a different outlook on life this year.
Thank you very much to Polly for taking part in this interview. And thank you to you, as always, for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.